Welcome back to the table, friends. This is your humble host, GreyDMs. With me, as always, is Owen.
I'm Owen.
Hey, Owen.
Yeah.
What did you bring to the table tonight?
I brought something that while I read it, I'm going to get angry, and I hope you do too.
That's so... Everybody clicked off.
Yeah, I know.
I can't wait to see that
Dip.
drop off where I'm like, oh, what is it? It was exactly at 26 seconds that everybody stopped listening. All right. Let's do this. Let's dive into the pit of rage.
Today, we're digging into the soil where the dark future was first planted.
Oh.
Forget the glittering chrome of Night City for a moment. We're going back to the blood-soaked jungles of Central America, to a time when our world broke away from its destiny and stumbled into a nightmare. We're talking about Cyberpunk.
Mantis blades.
Yeah, I was going to say, those sounds have nothing to do with Cyberpunk, but okay. So this is not a clean story. It's dirty, ugly tale of drug war that became a shooting war, a conflict with no clear enemy, no final victor, and no moral center. In our reality, the late 80s and early 90s saw U.S. drug policy escalate, but the cyberpunk timeline was a spark that ignited a firestorm. It began with a seemingly clinical decision by bureaucrats to declare drug cartels hostile, non-state combatants. A legal phrase that sounds harmless, but was a declaration of total war. It meant the U.S. military could treat entire regions as war zones, and any government that failed to stop the flow of drugs was painted as a co-conspirator. Civilian governments in Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua were no longer partners. They were obstacles to be bypassed or removed. Proxy wars erupted into open conflicts, and jungle strikes became city occupations. The U.S. military found itself in a quagmire more brutal than Vietnam. It was a ghost war, a counterinsurgency where the enemy was not just the narco armies, but the very terrain and the population. The guerrillas were better funded, better armed, and better informed than the American troops chasing them through the dense jungles. They were fighting on their home turf with the support of a populace that saw the GIs not as liberators but as invaders. And it was all because of a weapon that was meant to be the final solution: bioweapons. The U.S. government deployed bioengineered crop destroyers in operations with chillingly impersonal names like Desert Vulture and Ghost Canyon. These were meant to kill the cocoa... Huh?
Agent Orange.
Yeah, or Agent Orange. These were meant to kill the cocoa and poppy plants to choke the life out of the cartel's income. But these bioweapons didn't just kill crops. They scarred the earth and poisoned the local population's trust. They decimated indigenous farms and caused immense ecological damage. And, in a bitter irony that epitomizes the dark future, they didn't even work. Field reports from the period tell of a chilling game of cat and mouse. Enemy forces would return to the dead zones of the jungle with new seeds resistant to the pathogens. These new strains were often purchased through backdoor deals with shadowy European biotech firms, the first canonical example of corporations quietly playing both sides of a conflict for their own long-term gain. The bioagents didn't win the war, they just mutated it, making the enemy more resilient and the corporations even richer. The war's most enduring legacy was the shattered lives of the American soldiers who returned home. Tens of thousands came back, not a ticker-tape parade, but to a collapsing economy and a government on the verge of ruin. The demand for advanced prosthetics and cybernetic limbs to replace lost limbs became a new kind of gold rush. Companies like Militech and Arasaka, who had been quietly supplying the war effort, now saw a chance to dominate the civilian market. The suffering of veterans became a profitable new frontier. The first Central American conflict wasn't just a failed military operation, it was a crucible in which the cyberpunk world was forged. It taught the world that governments were weak and corrupt, and technology could be both a liberator and a weapon, and that corporations with their limitless resources and ruthless pragmatism were the true masters of the coming age. The first Central American conflict served as a crucible for the advanced surveillance and mobility platforms that define the cyberpunk world, mirroring a troubled trend we're seeing today. While the military-industrial complex of the late 20th century was already a massive force, the war in the cyberpunk timeline fully institutionalized the role of corporations in military operations. This wasn't just about selling hardware, it was about embedding private interests directly into the battlefield. In this conflict, the U.S. military tested early versions of orbital reconnaissance satellites. These eyes in the skies provided real-time targeting data for VTOL strike craft, unmanned drones, and elite ghost teams on the ground. This sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel, but it's now a grim reality.
I was going to say, not anymore.
Today's commercial satellite imagery from real-world companies like Maxar Technologies and Planet Labs is so advanced that it's used from everything from tracking troop movements to monitoring the aftermath of natural disasters. The technologies deployed in the cyberpunk universe were not solely developed by the government. Corporations like International Electric Corporation, ICE, provided satellite infrastructure, while others like Microtech and Savoil, supplied materials for advanced armor and fuel. This is a direct parallel to our modern world. Today, major tech companies like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft hold multi-billion-dollar defense contracts, providing the Pentagon with everything from cloud computing services for data management to advanced AI platforms for intelligence analysis. What's even more chilling is the in-universe practice of corporations inserting their own personnel directly into the field. These weren't just mercenaries, they were R&D engineers, logistics officers, and security liaisons. This was the prototype for the embedded contractor role that would dominate military procurement. This reflects today's reality, where companies like Palantir Technologies provide their data mining software and analysis directly to military and intelligence agencies to assist in counterinsurgency efforts and threat analysis. The line between corporate and military personnel is more blurred than ever. The first Central American conflict laid the groundwork for a world where corporations aren't just suppliers, they are active participants in global conflicts. The fusion of surveillance technology and corporate power, a core theme of cyberpunk, has become a very real and present part of our world. So, the Panama Canal, perhaps you've heard of it, stands as the most enduring symbol of the American downfall in the cyberpunk universe. In our real-world timeline, the Torrijos-Carter Treaty set in motion the handover of the canal to Panama by 1999, a move seen by many as a step away from American imperialism and towards a more cooperative foreign policy. In the cyberpunk timeline, this pivotal decision never happens. The U.S., citing a deterioration of security situation, refuses to relinquish control, turning the canal zone into a fortified military and corporate stronghold. This decision is not just a point of divergence, it's a profound statement on the U.S.'s descent into a hyper-militarized, corporate-dominated state. The canal zone becomes a fortress, ringed with bases, anti-air defenses, and command bunkers, staffed by both U.S. troops and corporate auxiliaries. This is where the lore becomes particularly resonant with our own world. The Panama Canal is a classic choke point, a narrow, strategic waterway vital for global trade. Just as the Suez Canal and the Straits of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca are critical to modern-day supply chains, the Panama Canal is the key to maritime trade between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In our world, we've seen how easily these checkpoints can be disrupted, whether by geopolitical conflict, like the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, or even by a single container ship getting stuck, as happened in the Suez Canal. In Cyberpunk, the U.S. doesn't just recognize this reality, it weaponizes it. The canal zone becomes a corporate military final stand, a microcosm of the New World Order. When the U.S. ground forces are forced to withdraw from the broader region in 1994, the canal zone becomes their last bastion, a literal symbol of American retreat. This moment teaches corporations a chillingly pragmatic lesson. You don't need to own territory to control it, you only need to own the choke points. This idea of corporate control over vital infrastructure is no longer science fiction. In our own world, private companies manage ports, pipelines, and data centers. The Hutchinson Ports Group, a Hong Kong-based company, operates terminals in over 50 ports around the globe. While not a military force, their control over this critical infrastructure gives them immense economic and, by extension, political power. The cyberpunk universe took this concept and pushed it to its logical, sensational conclusion, a world where the corporations that own the choke points are the ones who truly hold the power. While the U.S. military fought and failed in the Central American jungle, a far more significant collapse was unfolding on Wall Street. The crash of '94 is Cyberpunk's equivalent of the 2008 financial crisis, but it was far more devastating and happened decades earlier. In the game's lore, over-leveraged banks, a ballooning national debt, and speculative investments in massive mega projects triggered a cascading financial failure that crippled both the U.S. and Asian markets. The fictional crisis combines elements of real-world financial disasters. The sudden massive market crash mirrors 1987's Black Monday, and the bursting of a massive speculative bubble is reminiscent of the Japanese asset bubble burst of the early 1990s. But in the cyberpunk universe, the outcome was catastrophic. Markets plummeted, entire industries vanished overnight, and global credit lines froze completely. This financial chaos provided the perfect opportunity for the covert U.S. intelligence group, the Gang of Four, that would be the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and DEA, to seize control, citing a domestic emergency. They bypassed Congress and enforced martial law in the name of economic security. This move solidified the idea that the U.S. government was no longer a functioning democracy, but a puppet state controlled by a deep state intelligence apparatus. Meanwhile, in Europe, a very different outcome unfolded. The European Economic Community, which in our timeline would become the EU, took decisive action. Rather than collapsing, it stabilized, adopted the Eurodollar as a stable currency, and began providing loans not to people but directly to states. This move essentially turned sovereign nations into clients. This is the birth of the Eurocorps, transnational banks, tech firms, and industrial conglomerates like IEC, the European Space Agency ESA, and Euro business machines. These corporations became the real lenders of last resort, and with financial control came unprecedented political control. By the year 2000, the United States was no longer the global economic hegemon. It was now deeply indebted to these new Eurocorps, which operated across broader and above national laws. This shift fundamentally alters the global power structure, with economic power moving from sovereign nations to multinational corporations. The crash of '94 proved that the true power lay not in military might, but in the merciless efficiency of the global financial market. While Militech was aggressively expanding through military hardware contracts in the Americas, Arasaka played a much quieter, more calculating game. The company's strategy was a direct response to Japan's post-war constitution, which prevented the country from projecting military force. Arasaka's founder, Saburo Arasaka, circumvented this limitation by redefining the concept of a corporation. If a corporation was a person, under the law, why couldn't it have its own army? This simple legal fiction allowed Arasaka to build a private military force that was, in many ways, more powerful than the armed forces of many sovereign nations. Arasaka's model was not about direct conquest, but about insurance and influence. They offered security not as a last resort in a war, but as a preventative measure. They embedded their highly trained security teams, who were much more than simply bodyguards, into corporate embassies, bank offices, and research facilities across the globe. These agents served as investigators, asset protectors, and, when necessary, silent executors. In Asia, their role was to protect assets from industrial espionage and sabotage. In the collapsing United States, they became the go-to solution for high net worth protection. The quintessential example of Arasaka's method is a well-known, though officially redacted incident in Night City. A dispute between two rival biotech firms, centered on stolen genetic data, began to escalate. While Militech would have likely proposed a full-scale assault, Arasaka's approach was surgical. Instead of a direct raid, Arasaka's operatives infiltrated both firms. They didn't just stop the conflict, they exploited it. They collected extensive surveillance on both companies, including boardroom conversations and off-the-books transactions. Then, through a series of accidental data leaks and quiet conversations, Arasaka used the information they had gathered as leverage. They didn't just end the dispute, they made it clear that they knew every secret, every weakness, and every dirty deal. The result was not military victory, but a quiet display of power. Arasaka's presence subtly influenced board votes, reshaped corporate policy, and gave them a permanent controlling stake in both companies. The incident, and others like it, perfectly illustrates the Arasaka model, not brute force, but calculated pressure. They don't need to win battles when they can prevent them, making it clear to their rivals that the alternative is their protection in corporate extinction. This strategy of financial and information warfare rather than open conflict is the true source of Arasaka's immense power. The end of the First Central American conflict wasn't a victory. It was a military and political defeat. Thousands of veterans returned to a country that was no longer recognizable. The federal government, crippled by the crash of '94, was a ghost of its former self, its power usurped by shadow agencies and corporations. With no equivalent of the GI Bill and a military that had outsourced much of its operations to private firms like Militech, veterans found themselves with a unique set of skills but no place to use them. This scenario has a powerful parallel in our own history. Following the Vietnam War, many veterans returned home to a country that was not only politically divided, but also economically unstable. The romanticized image of the returning hero clashed with the harsh realities of unemployment, psychological trauma, and a lack of support from a government that had spent more than it could afford on a protracted and unpopular conflict. In the cyberpunk timeline, this historical reality is amplified to a catastrophic degree. Veterans are not just unemployed, they are redundant in a world where corporate militaries have taken over. Stripped of their uniforms and a sense of purpose, these veterans were forced to take work wherever they could find it, often as security guards, corporate enforcers, or bodyguards for the wealthy. This desperate need for survival forged a new social class, the Edgerunners. They were individuals who lived on the fringes of society, existing in the shadows between the law and the criminal underworld. A key cultural landmark for this new class is the Forlorn Hope, a Night City bar established in 2011. This bar, founded by retired combat officer Lieutenant Santiago, becomes more than just a drinking spot. It becomes a haven and a recruitment center for mercenaries and war vets. Santiago, a character who appears in both the Cyberpunk 2020 and Cyberpunk Red tabletop games, symbolizes the shift from uninformed service to... Okay, I wrote that wrong. Santiago, a character who appears in both the Cyberpunk 2020 and Cyberpunk Red tabletop games, symbolizes the shift from a uniformed service to privatized violence. The bar's name, the Forlorn Hope, is a real-world military term for a group of soldiers selected to lead a high-risk attack. This name perfectly encapsulates the desperate, high-stakes lives of its clientele. The Edgerunners who congregated at Forlorn Hope were not just skilled fighters, they were morally unmoored. They were veterans of a pointless war, and now they were caught in the gravitational pull of the corporate wars to come. They sold their skills to the highest bidder, blurring the line between soldier and criminal. This mercenary class forms the cultural and narrative background of the cyberpunk genre, a grim reflection of society that discards its soldiers when they are no longer useful and then buys their services back at a steep price. Militech's ascension to global power wasn't an overnight success. It was a methodical campaign that began long before the First Central American conflict. Founded in the 1990s by a former military officer, Militech quickly established itself as a premier military technology corporation. It focused on producing high-quality, reliable weaponry and tactical gear. This early reputation for excellence, combined with its founders' connections, allowed it to secure lucrative government contracts. By the time the world began its descent into the dark future, Militech was already a major player, but its true power was not yet to be realized. Militech's rise to dominance wasn't just about selling more guns. It was about fundamentally rewriting the rules of military procurement. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, the company aggressively promoted the cost-plus model. In this system, the U.S. government paid all the costs associated with the development, testing, and logistical deployment of new weapon systems. In return, Militech was given a guaranteed profit, often a fixed percentage of total cost. The catch? Militech retained the patents and intellectual property for all the technology, as well as the control of the elite strike units that used it. This practice has a clear real-world parallel in the modern military-industrial complex. For decades, companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman have operated under similar arrangements, with government funding fueling the development of stealth bombers, missile defense systems, and fighter jets. In many cases, the state pays for the research and development, but the private company owns the technology. This creates a powerful feedback loop where the government becomes dependent on these companies for the defense needs, and the companies are guaranteed a steady stream of revenue regardless of cost overruns.
Holy crap.
Yeah.
That's an amazing... Okay, so right now we're going to need the government to pay us to make the next big TTRPG, and we are going to then provide that to all the soldiers, to all the government employees, but once again, we retain the rights to it so that we can produce it in the public, in the private.
For a hefty percentage.
Yeah, that's some glorious incompetence and corruption. Oh my God.
And you wonder why certain politicians of the past said, do not allow the military complex to gain control. And look where we are. Wow. In the long arc of Cyberpunk's economic history, the model transforms the state into a junior partner in its own defense. By 2020, the consequences are stark and visible. U.S. police departments are no longer equipped by the government. They are buying armored vehicles from the same corporate catalogs used by Militech's rapid response teams. City governments, cash-strapped and inefficient, begin to outsource riot suppression to private firms. Disaster response, a traditionally public service, is contracted out to a fuel and energy corporation like Savoil. Even intelligence work, once the exclusive domain of federal agencies, is handled by private cyber espionage teams hired from companies like IEC or Netwatch subsidiaries. In Night City, this privatization is not an abstract economic trend. It's a literal fact of life. Your neighborhood security is not provided by public police force, but by corporate security, such as Arasaka Quick Response or Militech Peacekeeping. This creates a system of two-tiered law enforcement, where the wealthy and well-connected are protected by highly trained corporate forces, while the rest of the populace is left to fend for themselves. This environment, where the public safety is a commodity, not a right, is the ultimate result of Militech's ruthless strategy. They didn't just sell weapons, they sold the state's sovereignty, piece by piece, until the government was no longer a provider of services but merely a captive client. In the lore of Cyberpunk, the story of Tesla Johansson is a harsh lesson on the limits of truth in a world where power is unaccountable. Johansson, a determined reporter for World News Service, is one of the most famous names in cyberpunk journalism. Her investigation into the first Central American conflict uncovered a shocking truth. U.S. intelligence agencies, specifically the NSA, had deliberately manipulated intelligence. Her expose, titled "The Data That Screamed," revealed that the intelligence community had knowingly fed false information to the public and to military commanders to justify troop deployments and, more cynically, to increase defense budgets. This narrative has a clear, chilling parallel in the real world: the use of fabricated or misleading intelligence to justify military action is a reoccurring theme. The most well-known example in recent history is the lead-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where claims of weapons of mass destruction were used as a primary justification for the war. In both the cyberpunk universe and our own, the revelations, while shocking, did not lead to a dismantling of the systems that created the lies. The public's reaction to Johansson's expose and the cyberpunk world is telling. They are horrified, but only for a week. Then the news cycle moves on. The system holds, the Gang of Four remains in power, and their control is stronger than ever. The public's brief outrage is a fleeting moment in a world where constant crisis and distractions have become the norm. The story of Tesla Johansson serves as a grim warning. She is blacklisted, her career destroyed. She is harassed and eventually vanishes from public life. Her final report on the privatization of orbital weather control serving as a final desperate attempt to expose a world where even the clouds are for sale. Johansson's ultimate fate reinforces Cyberpunk's central pessimistic theme. Revelation changes nothing when power is unaccountable. Her story is not a tale of a lone hero bringing down a corrupt system. It's the story of a system that is so deeply entrenched and so ruthless in its pursuit of power that it can simply absorb a revelation of its own wrongdoing and carry on as if nothing happened. The truth becomes just another piece of data easily lost in the noise of a world spiraling into chaos. Following the financial collapse, the U.S. federal government began to lease back its own infrastructure. The U.S. government had to lease back its own infrastructure.
You know, if only she had found like a list of a bunch of like higher ups who had like
names
gone
of
to an
people that
island
had
and,
done things
raped
like that.
little children and stuff.
God,
Man,
only something
that
like
would have saved
existed.
her. Yeah, that would have saved her.
Leaseback zone, marking a symbolic and literal end to its status as a global superpower. This wasn't a sudden event, but a gradual transactional process that saw the government sell off its core assets to corporations. Railways were sold to Savoil, water purification in southern states was turned over to Biotechnica, and portions of the highway and electrical grid fell under the management of IEC and Petrochem. This practice has clear parallels in real-world history. In the 1980s and 1990s, many nations undergoing economic crisis resorted to mass privatization. Argentina sold off its public rail network, and Russia's state-owned oil sector was privatized in a move that created a new class of oligarchs. Even in the U.S., post-Katrina reconstruction efforts saw massive infrastructure bids go to private companies, showing how disaster can be a catalyst for corporate control. By 1999, internal memos from the NNC, National News Channel, confirmed that what the public had long suspected. The federal government had no plan to reclaim control. This realization led to the formalization of public-private recovery partnerships, which is a polite term for corporate administrative zones. Once taboo concepts like corporate jurisdiction were quietly legalized under the guise of emergency legislation, effectively turning government functions into corporate services. A prime example of this is Night City itself, which was originally founded as Coronado City. It became a corporate city-state under the guidance of its founder, Richard Knight, and a group of megacorp investors. The city's governance was now a corporate matter, with its laws and services managed for profit. The world of cyberpunk turned these real-world privatization trends into the default, creating a society where the government is not the apex of power, but simply another client. One of the most significant and under-discussed turning points in the cyberpunk timeline is what happens after the United States' ignominious departure from Central America. Unlike in our history, where the region struggled with internal conflicts and dependency on foreign powers, the cyberpunk lore shows a different path. Following the U.S. withdrawal, the nations of Central America form a loose confederation of post-revolutionary states, united by a commitment to mutual aid and independence from foreign control. These nations aren't utopia, but they are functional and self-sufficient. They deliberately avoid doing business with the U.S. and its major corporations, particularly Militech. The governments and people of these nations remember the U.S. occupation, the destruction caused by the bioengineered crop destroyers, and the broken promises. The resistance becomes an exportable commodity. By the early 2000s, this model of independence spreads to South America. Nations begin to nationalize their energy and agricultural technology sectors. Brazil emerges as a major economical powerhouse, and Colombia becomes a hub for cybernetic research and development. Even parts of the Caribbean align more closely with Eurocorp banking and logistics. This geopolitical shift creates a world where the U.S., once a dominant colossus, is now economically and politically isolated. It is fenced off by its own massive debt, by the deep-seated distrust of its former allies, by its own internal fragmentation. The U.S. is no longer a global superpower. It is a client state reliant on the very corporations that it helped create. By the early 2000s, the world was no longer in the grip of a single superpower. The stage was set for the ultimate conflict, a global showdown between two of the most powerful megacorporations in the history of the world, Militech and Arasaka. They were no longer just defense contractors, they had become military alliances and corporate clothing, each vying for global dominance. Militech, with its roots deeply embedded in the fractured remnants of the U.S. government, began its expansion by arming police forces across North America. This wasn't just a simple supply chain, it was a calculated move to integrate their technology and personnel into the fabric of American law enforcement. In cities like Detroit, police officers were equipped with Militech smart guns and light armored vehicles, effectively turning public servants into an extension of a private corporation. In Phoenix, riot suppression was entirely outsourced to a Militech urban pacification unit operating under city contract. This practice of privatization public safety was a clear and terrifying sign of the government's decline. By 2010, Militech's peacekeeping divisions were active in over 40 countries and 5 continents, acting as both assistants and, in some cases, occupiers. While Militech was a visible force, Arasaka operated with a more subtle and insidious strategy. It became the most powerful private security force in history, building a global empire through data espionage and assassination. Arasaka's uniformed operatives were a common sight on the corporate campuses in major cities like London, Seoul, Berlin, and Johannesburg. Their purpose was not just to provide security, but to gather intelligence and protect corporate assets from industrial espionage. The company's corporate recovery teams, which were essentially highly trained assassination squads, operated with almost no oversight, eliminating threats to corporate interests. Arasaka's data encryption standards became the gold standard for corporate espionage protection, a testament to their mastery of information warfare. The inevitable collision between these two giants culminated in the first corporate war in 2004. The war, which was nominally a trade conflict between EBM, Euro Business Machines, and IEC, drew in proxy support from both Militech and Arasaka. This was the first open acknowledgement that corporations were no longer fighting for profits metaphorically, they were fighting literal wars. The conflict was not a conventional large-scale engagement, but a series of black ops, sabotage missions, and contract warfare. It was fought in cyberspace, in courtrooms, and in isolated skirmishes, with Militech and Arasaka using their corporate and military power to outmaneuver each other. This war solidified the global power dynamic, with corporations as the new superpower and nations as little more as their clients. In the world of Cyberpunk, the most potent weapon isn't a smart gun, it's economical control. Following the crash of '94, the US could no longer mint a global currency. The euro dollar, or the eddy, became the new standard, and megacorporations like Petrochem and Biotechnica began creating their own currencies. This transformed currency into an expression of brand loyalty. You weren't paid in money, you were paid in Militech bucks or Arasaka credit. These were not cryptocurrencies, they were corporate, feudal currencies tied directly to a single corporation's ecosystem. You could only spend them at approved locations, and a practice that created a captive economy where employees and vendors were locked into a financial relationship with their corporate masters. This concept of corporate-controlled currency has clear real-world parallels. While not a national currency, company script was common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it's making a comeback. Many coal mining and logging companies paid their employees in their own form of currency, which could only be used at the company store. This system ensured that workers' wages always flowed back to the corporation, creating a cycle of dependency. In the modern world, this practice has evolved. Companies like Amazon and Google have created sprawling ecosystems where their own payment systems and platforms are the preferred or only way to conduct business. Amazon's use of Amazon Pay and its vast network of vendors and services creates a closed-loop system that keeps consumers and sellers within its ecosystem. The most profound parallel, however, is the shift in power from nations to corporations. The cyberpunk universe depicts nations borrowing from corporations, not the other way around. This reflects a reality where companies and financial institutions hold immense power over governments. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank can dictate economic policies to nations in exchange for loans, a practice that gives them significant control over a country's sovereignty. In the cyberpunk world, this is simply taken to its logical conclusions, with corporations like IEC and the Lazarus Group acting as the ultimate creditors, holding nations accountable through their debt ledgers rather than military force. The message is clear. Corporations do not answer to borders. In the dark future, and in many ways in our own world, the true power lies not in military might, but in economic control. While Militech and Arasaka were fighting for military dominance, Biotechnica was quietly rising to power by controlling the very fundamentals of survival: food and fuel. Originally a research conglomerate specializing in genetics and food technology, Biotechnica exploded in relevance after the economic crash of the mid-1990s when traditional agricultural systems collapsed. In 1997, Biotechnica unveiled its masterpiece, Chew2. This revolutionary ethanol algae fuel blend quickly replaced gasoline as the new global energy standard. This was a massive win for the company, as the infrastructure required to grow, refine, and distribute Chew2 made Biotechnica an indispensable player in the global economy. Governments and corporations alike became utterly dependent on Biotechnica, which responded by embedding its operatives in agricultural ministries and energy policy councils across the globe. Biotechnica's control didn't stop at energy. It extended to the very food people ate. The company patented gene-locked seeds, which forced farmers to buy new seed stock every single planting cycle. This effectively turned food into a licensed product rather than a freely harvested crop. This aspect of the lore mirrors real-world concerns about GMOs and seed monopolies, particularly those associated with companies like Monsanto, now part of Bayer. In the Cyberpunk universe, however, this practice is taken to its logical and terrifying conclusion. Biotechnica not only owns the crops, but it owns the genetic code of the food itself. This control over essential resources gave Biotechnica a unique and powerful form of leverage. While other megacorps were fighting for military or financial dominance, Biotechnica was quietly building its empire by controlling the most fundamental elements of life. The First Corporate War came to a close not with a decisive victory, but from sheer exhaustion. By 2006, both IEC and EBM had bled so much money and lost so many key assets that the conflict was no longer profitable. IEC had lost multiple data centers and was facing an internal shareholder revolt. EBM was crippled by debt after its supply chains were relentlessly sabotaged. With their proxy corporations, Militech and Arasaka, also suffering from scrutiny and losses, the war became unsustainable. The European Space Agency, ESA, and other neutral Eurocorps intervened, brokering a quiet truce. The two warring corporations signed a treaty that shared satellite bandwidth and established a system of private arbitration for future disputes, with no public trials, reparations, or admissions of guilt. This outcome had a profound and lasting impact on the world. The war normalized the concept of armed conflict between corporations, proving that violence could be a viable tool for business negotiations as long as it remained contained and profitable. It cemented Militech and Arasaka as bitter rivals, setting the stage for future conflicts. The war also created a massive new market for private military contractors, fueling the rise of the Edgerunner class of mercenaries. In essence, the First Corporate War taught the world that in the dark future, victory was not about conquest, but about leverage, and that the real power belonged to those who controlled the global economy. As the 2000s progressed in the cyberpunk universe, traditional governments became a symbolic entities. Parliament buildings and presidential offices still exist, and leaders still deliver speeches, but their authority is purely ceremonial. Real decisions, from military deployments to currency stabilization, are made by corporations. This is because governments, now broke and indebted, have outsourced their core functions to these private entities. The new USA, new United States of America, and the Cyberpunk Red tabletop game provides a clear example. The government has nationalized Militech, but this action doesn't signify control. Instead, it's a partnership. Militech gains legitimacy and stable budget, while the new USA gets access to soldiers and logistics. This arrangement is a corporate merger disguised as patriotism. In Europe, the power shift is even more pronounced. Nation-states have become shareholders in regional Eurocorps, which effectively turns international diplomacy into boardroom negotiations. In this new world order, political success isn't about winning elections, it's about winning shareholder confidence. The state, once the ultimate authority has become a ghost, its responsibilities absorbed by the very corporations it once regulated. Happy ending.
Hey, this is a really cool cyberpunk LARP that we've been living.
Yeah, I'm about done with this LARP. Can we Can we play something else?
Yeah, let's get something in lighter in tone like Vampire.
There's so much less corruption and just evil in Vampire.
We know where it is.
Yeah.
It's very clear and apparent.
Yeah.
It's like when the undead are the ones doing all the bad stuff, you can be like, oh, those cursed undead. Oh, we'll get you good. Ooh.
Yeah. So there you go. That's our glimpse into the future, folks.
It's the history of Cyberpunk.
Wow. Some of the history of Cyberpunk.
Cyberpunk. It's a big.
Cyberpunk is massive. This is literally just scratching the surface.
But it is very interesting in what they took and what they prophesized.
Yeah.
And all the in between that we currently live in. So, yeah, hey, get yourself some gorilla arms or some mantis blade.
Yeah.
Take to the streets and
for nanowire, but yeah.
Oh, really? That was your go-to?
Yeah. I was always hacking. I couldn't go straight.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. I just love punch people. I was Batman. I was just like, I won't do the dark. I want to sneak around and then punch people.
Yeah. No.
It was too much fun. All right. Well, yeah, cool. I hope you got a little taste of the Cyberpunk background. And,
you guys liked it and look into it. Play Cyberpunk 2077 if you haven't. It's a good game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't look at the stuff about when it first came out. They fixed all of that. Yes, it's a pretty stable and pretty fun game to play.
And find some Edgerunners of your own and sit around a table and fight the power. Right?
Fight the power. Become the power.
All right, guys.
Bye.
See you visit.